our the workshop, just like we did with the advisory group. Are we on? Okay. Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Welcome back to our second of two meetings today. The first part of the day is, for those of you who weren't here, was the bar advisory group. We meet quarterly, and we had a meeting, a very good meeting with almost ran up to the 12:30 time slot, and hopefully everybody was able to get some lunch and join us for this second meeting, which is a regulatory workshop. My name is Patrick DeRay, Chief of the Bureau of Automotive Repair, and we scheduled this workshop to involve our advisory group members and the public in a discussion of a, I wouldn't even call it a regulatory proposal. It is, no denying that, but it's more of just kind of a follow through with some legislation that was vetoed last year, Senate Bill 778 by Senator Allen, and I think we had kind of reached out to Senator Allen following that and said that we would look at maybe trying to look at a way to do this through regulation as it related to our registrants and applying the Automotive Repair Act and some of the things that they were looking to do in that legislation with respect to disclosures on oil change service intervals. So this is a kind of a good faith effort to honor that commitment and that discussion that followed after the veto of the legislation. So it's just a draft. It's a working draft. I'm not sure exactly where it will go, if it will even go beyond this discussion point. But we wanted to bring everybody to the table to kind of have that discussion, because I know there's a lot of different views on it. And I'm not sure if they all got represented during the legislative process. I don't even know if they all got heard by the Department of Consumer Affairs or Bureau of Automotive Repair. So it's an opportunity for us to have that discussion with all of you. So I thank you for your attendance and hopefully your participation in this. Since we are being webcast, if I could have you do us a favor, we're first going to have a presentation and kind of an overview of the provisions, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions or comments. And if you're going to speak, please, just because for the courtesy of those who are listening in and this meeting being webcast and all, please introduce yourselves and your organization. That would help. All right. We'll get started. I'm going to turn it over to Brian Clark, who is in our Bureau front office, executive office. He's working on a couple of legislative and regulatory matters. And we just brought you on how many months ago? Not too long ago. He's been here.
January.
Yeah. He's been here, just at the very beginning of the year. So we're happy to have him. He's an attorney who started his career in New York, Buffalo area, and a few years ago moved out to California and was working with another state agency before we were fortunate enough to bring him on board at the beginning of this year to work on some legislation and regulations. So I'll turn it over to Brian. I think the presentation is behind me, and he'll go through the slides and tell you how we got to the meeting today.
As Patrick has stated, the proposed regulatory revisions.
Can I do one last? I'm sorry, before you get started, maybe we could go around the room real quickly and do some introductions. That probably would be helpful for everyone. Ruben, you want to start us off?
Sure.
Okay.
Ruben Parra with California Automotive Teachers.
Danny Bowen with the Automotive Maintenance and Repair Association.
Jeff Tassel, Automotive Maintenance and Repair Association.
Jack O'Donnell, California Automotive Association. Evolve H Mobile Services.
Tim Fogelquist, Bridgestone Retail Operations.
John Gallo, California Automotive Business Coalition.
Bud Rice Quality Tune-Up Shops.
Aaron Lowe, Auto Care Association.
Dave Abraham, Sears Auto Centers.
Tom McVeigh, Quality Tune-Up Shops.
Mike Knutson, Automobile Club of Southern California.
Tracy Renee, Automotive Service Councils of California.
Sergio Marchetti, Bureau of Automotive Repair.
Mike Clark, Bureau of Auto Repair.
Before we move on, is this going to actually be recorded as well, so it's available hereafter?
Is it recorded?
Correct, yeah, and that's, it's important to speak into the microphones so that
Yeah.
that gets picked up on the recording.
Yeah. I don't know about the mic levels. Are they
Don't think it works.
mic levels? Okay. Okay, you can even hear people who are a little bit off to the left or right of the microphone?
A little bit, but it's better.
If you're right on it. Okay, so we'll try to, before you speak, pass around one of the mics that's nearest to you. Okay, thank you. We'll proceed.
Once again, so the proposed regulatory package, as Patrick had made a reference to, is an attempt to get through the regulatory process some of the invoicing and disclosure requirements for oil change intervals that were contained within SB 778, specifically the section that would have been Section 9890 of the Automotive Repair Act if it had not been vetoed by the governor. In regards to the proposed changes, the changes would be focused, would be contained in section 3356, specifically 3356C, Charlie, and it would revise the ARD invoice requirements as follows. First off, 3356C1 would require when an ARD performs an oil change, the following disclosure statement would be required on the invoice or on a document attached to the invoice. The statement specifically would be, it is important to change your oil at the proper intervals. Your vehicle manufacturer publishes oil change intervals in your owner's manual and on the manufacturer's website.
And that language, this is Pat Duray from the Bureau again, and that language specifically, that came straight from the legislation, did it not?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. So just to, whenever an oil change would be performed, that language would have to go onto the invoice or on a document attached to the invoice. Moving on to 3356C2, the second requirement would be if an ARD recommends a time frame, date, or mileage interval for an oil change that deviates from the vehicle manufacturer's published maintenance schedule, the dealer's basis for the recommendation would need to be included on the invoice or on a document attached to the invoice. So if a dealer was going, an ARD was going to recommend, if a vehicle had a mileage interval, the manufacturer recommended, say, 5,000 miles, and the dealer was going to recommend an interval of, say, 3,000 miles, the reason for that recommendation would have to be included on the invoice or in a document attached to the invoice. In addition, just in terms of disclosure, when reviewing the language or the proposed language, there would be additional revisions that would be non-substantive in nature, and that would be to the enumeration of what is now an additional pending regulatory package for electronic documents and consumer authorization. So if this present one, the one for the oil change interval, was to go forward, and the electronic documents package was passed, it would revise the pending package in terms of anything after C would be bumped down. So, currently it would go through C through G, and it would create an H because everything would just be bumped down because we'd be inserting this language into the existing subsection C. So everything would go down one.
So if I could just step in here for just a brief moment for some who are new to that issue or that discussion. We have a electronic documents and authorization regulatory package bringing BAR into the 21st century once and for all, and catching up a little bit here to allow for electronic estimates and authorizations. That package is touching upon the very same sections that we're looking at here. So and it's ahead of this schedule. So anything we do in this area would touch upon that area that's already pending and further along in the process. So we'd have to do, as Brian was kind of alluding to, we'd have to do some renumbering of those sections.
And if you're interested in looking at that package and what potential, the renumberings, how that would work out, it is on the BAR website in the section where all the the workshop information, the materials, and the webcast are kept. And that one was on July 21st, 2016. And the package is currently pending PCA and agency approval. So it hasn't gone to the Office of Administrative Law yet. We're still waiting on approval. And once we get that approval, then we will file it for review. So it's already been out for notice, and we would send it up to OAL for review and approval. Closing back onto the changes at hand, for purposes of 3356C, 3356C3 states that the terms recommends or recommendation would mean, and the terms would include but not be exclusively limited to recommendations in the form of window stickers, key tags, programmable settings in a vehicle's oil life indicator, but would not include communications or advertisements that do not suggest a time frame, date or mileage interval, or date or mileage interval for an oil change, and it would also not include resetting a preset or non-programmable oil life indicator or oil life monitor based on a mathematical algorithm or vehicle's usage. So, I mean, if you're going to write so basically the recommends or recommendation would include anytime you're going to recommend a specific mileage on a sticker or a tag, or if there's a programmable oil life indicator where that where it would indicate an oil change was required based on programmable settings that the ARD would input at the time of the oil change. And it would not include things such as general advertisements for oil change specials or any type of advertisement that does not suggest, you should have your oil changed at 3,000 miles. It's something along that nature. Or just merely resetting that programmable, idiot light that comes on. I mean, in my car, it comes on every 5,000 miles and I get the oil changed, and then somebody resets it because it's off when I get the car back. Something like that would not be within the ambit of recommends or recommendation of a free. Moving on, 3356C4 specifically states that nothing in 3356C would prohibit a customer from selecting an oil change interval that differs from a vehicle manufacturer's published maintenance schedule, or an ARD from performing a customer requested oil change that deviates from that schedule. If that's the case where a customer comes in and requests, it says, I don't care if it's 5,000 miles, I want it done every 3,000 miles, so do it. Then the ARD, pursuant to the regulation in subparagraph 4, would just merely state on the invoice something along the natures of that the oil change was performed at the customer's request.
So in the scenario, pardon me, Jim Fogelquist with Bridgestone Retail Operations. In the scenario of where a light isn't on the dash stating that it's time to change the oil, we wouldn't probably know how long it had been since the last oil change. So wouldn't we technically have to state customer requests oil change any time that we couldn't verify how long it had been? In other words, if it was a store-reliant customer where we brought it up and said, hey, it's been 5,041 miles since you had your oil change and your light's on and it's got my brand filter on it, it's time to do it. But other than that scenario, wouldn't I have to put this language virtually on every oil change I ever write up?
Well, I mean, if you track that with your customers, where, if you put there's a tag or something along the lines of when the next oil change is recommended, that would fall into the ambit of this. I mean, I would say in that scenario, if you were able to solicit from the customer, when was the last time the oil change was performed? Do you know when the last time the oil change was? If it's somebody that's not into your facility and it's not something that you track. I just anticipate a scenario where, I go and get my oil change at the same place all the time, and every time I go in, they know they can look back and say, well, you had your oil changed done at 36,000 miles, so they would know that. But if you don't know that, I would say, to err on the side of compliance, that would probably be a best case scenario. I don't want to say that it would have to be done every time, but if you were not able to discern when the oil change was done, or just to tell the customer this is done every 5,000 miles, has it been 5,000 miles, you may want to err on that side and just write on there with a pen, oil change done at customer request. Moving on to the fifth slide, purpose and rationale. The statutory authority for the proposed regulations flows from Business and Professions Code, Section 9884.19, which states that BAR may adopt regulations that protect the public from inaccurate advertising, and also from BPC Section 9884.8, which states that all service work performed by ARDs be recorded and described on an invoice. Shifting over to the purpose behind the proposed regulations, advances in modern engines and improved oil formulas have made the 3,000-mile oil change interval largely obsolete, and many vehicles have manufacturer recommended oil change intervals of 5,000, 7,500, 10,000, or even more miles. However, many consumers may be unaware that their vehicle's recommended oil change interval is more than 3,000 miles. Unnecessary oil changes have a significant negative impact upon the environment. Used motor oil is one of the largest hazardous waste streams in California, and approximately 35 million gallons per year are not collected after use. Used motor oil is insoluble and contains heavy metals and toxic chemicals. It makes its way into the watershed and ocean and endangers wildlife. In addition, 1 gallon of used motor oil can follow the taste of 1 million gallons of water. Just in terms of full disclosure, these statistics were pulled from Cal Recycle's website. BAR is not regulating the oil change per se, but rather seeks to impose notice and disclosure requirements designed to make the public aware that oil changes do not necessarily have to be performed every 3,000 miles. The proposed revisions will help consumers make informed decisions about oil change intervals and will reduce unnecessary oil changes. This will save consumers money and protect the environment. Moving on to the open discussion, we have put together some discussion topics, and then at the end we can also discuss additional issues, any issues that are not up there that you feel are pertinent. So we'll get the ball rolling. How would proposed regulation impact your business practices?
Dave Abraham from Sears Auto Centers. The only thing I see it impacting at my store level is the documentation piece. They've got to make sure that they put it in there. We don't do them unless the customer requests it, or that's when we do the oil change anyway.
Okay. Anyone else?
Tracy Renee with the Automotive Service Councils of California. I'm just wondering, back to what he was discussing, if a customer's bringing a vehicle in and you've never seen it before, and they're asking for an oil change, that's obviously what you're going to put, requesting an oil change. So it's only when maybe the vehicle's there for some other reason, and then you're checking it over, and then you notice, maybe they have a sticker on there, maybe there's some other reasoning, maybe the oil looks terrible, that you would be recommending it, and then you have no history unless there's. So at that point, you're just documenting why you're recommending it. But do you I see the whole thing on here where customer recommends oil change. I see that being something that probably going to be used a lot okay? As a way of not really disclosing what's really. I already have from SB 778. I've already added that to my oil change service invoices, so it's been on there since that language first came out, just because I did think it was a good idea. So I, you know, I don't know. I think that it could get, tricky, some of this information, like you said, that you gather these statistics from that one website. I've gone on there and looked at when they're recommending oil change intervals versus, all data, other informational sources, factory, the book. Doesn't seem like all of those agree. There's too many different sources of information. Sometimes people's oil life monitors are reset, sometimes they aren't. I mean, there's things like that. I could just see, I think educating consumers and letting them know. And not to be just doing oil change. All of us.
Thanks for the comment. Before we get any further, I was reminded that those listening in on the webcast, if you have any questions or comments and want to participate that way, please send your comments or questions to barmeeting@dca.ca.gov, and they'll forward them up to the desk here where the discussion is occurring. Again, bar meeting, all one word, barmeeting@dca.ca.gov. Other comments, questions on?
Bud Rice, Quality Tune-Up Shops. So if I could take a couple steps back, it appears as though there's going to be a couple of times where this comes into play. One is outreach, when you're sending out advertising pieces and somebody responds. What do we say to that guy? Then it's somebody who comes in and says, yeah, I'd like to get an oil change done. What do we say to that guy? Then the car's in the shop because we're changing a fan belt or something, and we check his dipstick and we see the oil is dirty. Okay, now what do we say to that guy? So it would seem as though those seem to break into the three major areas of when we're going to have to communicate to somebody and what it is we ought to say, and then how do you document what it is on those three instances?
Well, I mean, in terms of the documentation, I mean, the focus on this is to provide, so we have informed consumers. So in any situation, I mean, if you look at, if you're performing service or they come in and they request an oil change and you're looking at this and you say to yourself, this needs an oil change, I mean, what would you say to the customer to get them to agree to have the oil change done? I mean, what you should do then is just put that onto the invoice. So in any of those three, what would you say to your customer for them to get them to agree to that oil change? And then it should be documented.
Go ahead, John.
John Gallup, California Automotive Business Coalition. Just to follow up on Bud's points, the thing that I see would be confusing and difficult would be for shops to program their POS systems to accommodate for all three of those scenarios every time and have people use it the right way. I would see that it would be easily confused for a salesperson or a service manager, service advisor to figure out, okay, which box do I check to have the point of sales terminal key up the same, the proper language for this particular scenario, because you're really talking, in essence, three different scenarios that could play out.
Yeah, this is a really helpful discussion for our purposes, and I'm not sure it's as cut and dry as maybe it was thought it would be doing this through legislation. It probably would have required some follow-up regulations on our part to kind of clarify some of the points. So this is really helpful. Thank you so much. So continuing the discussion, please.
Davey Bald, H Mobile Services. Something I want to throw in the mix, when a manufacturer recommends an oil change interval, that's for their new engines that are operating properly, where the rings are sealing and the PCB system properly. You have a high mileage engine where the rings don't seal as good as they were when they were new. That oil can turn black in 2,000 miles, worn out engine. So what would the proper interval be in that case?
Well, I guess, would you recommend an oil change to them, and why? And if all we're asking, I mean, the thrust of this is you would put your reason on the invoice. Yes.
I mean. What other there would be.
Well, I mean, I don't want to pigeonhole us into specific reasons, but I mean, like driving habits would be one, condition of the oil, any type of contamination. Well, I guess you would engage your customer and ask them questions about, what are your driving habits? Do you drive, I mean, is this highway driving? Is it city driving? Is it stop and go driving? I mean, those are the type of things that I would envision that, an ARD would engage the customer to find out what exactly is needed for their vehicle.
Oil registering.
There's no additional comments on that. Let's move on. The other issue that we were looking at to solicit some input from is manufacturers' oil change frequency schedules. The ease of access for those, are those just things that are readily available? Or is there any type of cost? Do you have to pay for that type of stuff, or is it something that they provide, or that is readily accessible by the ARDs?
It's something we do purchase. It is available, and like I said earlier, the information sometimes is different depending on which source you're getting it from, and the sources, I'll say they're getting their information from the manufacturer, so that gets a little confusing. All coming from the same place. Why is it different?
So, are there manufacturers that do not publish schedules that anybody knows of?
John Gallo, California Automotive Business Coalition. On the most part, the majority of the owner's manuals have the recommended intervals based on the types of driving. A lot of times the information, as Tracy has pointed out, you can get through all data and other sources and everything, but sometimes there is a disconnect between what the manufacturer says and what aftermarket sources are publishing based on different driving cycles, different uses of the vehicle, and so on and so forth. But I think the real challenge for the industry as they look at the proposed reg is to figure out how do you really comply with the variables that exist. Anything from the mileage indicator light to built-in software and systems within the vehicle that cause the indicators to come on. I don't see that a manufacturer is just going to arbitrarily change their software for California to comply with this regulation and not have an arithmetic mileage interval cycle that causes the light to come on. But as we look at the different oils and types of oils and the recommendations from different manufacturers and the points that were made earlier about a new vehicle versus an old vehicle with a lot of miles, let's face it, if we look at new cars, majority of the OEM manufacturers are recommending higher oil change cycles, not only because it has synthetic oil, but they're also trying to lower their cost of maintenance of that vehicle, and many of them are offering free services for the first 2 years. So all of a sudden you're seeing oil change recommendations of 7,500 miles, 10,000 miles, when there's a real question right now about the real integrity of an oil filter going 10,000 miles given the driving conditions. So there's a lot of factors to really consider when we're looking at oil change intervals. Should be an easy thing to figure out, but they no longer are because of all the different variables in play.
Also, the most new vehicles have oil life monitors, so nobody's recommending anything. It's saying, you know, it's time for your oil change, or percentage left, or whatever. So I'm wondering what year did that go into effect to where all vehicles have that? Is there a certain year that's just kind of in all vehicles?
No, I don't know.
I'm curious.
I don't know the answer to that question. Sorry. Maybe some of our staff or we could research that. Yeah, Lisa, do you want to?
What do you envision this looking like in terms of? Is it going to be just random audits? Is it going to be the response?
A lot of our work is based on consumer complaints, so I would envision that, yeah, holding true in this area.
Situation there would have to
Exactly.
Yes, and in a situation like that, I mean, it's not only just a check, but it's also, I mean, it would help to cover an ARD in a situation where somebody complains and says, you know, my oil life indicator says that, you know, I looked at my manual afterwards and it says I need this oil change done until 10,000 miles, and it hasn't been 10,000 miles. But then if you have on the invoice, you know, recommended oil change because of X reason, then you're covered. And as long as they agree, I mean, and they agree to it, I mean, that's, you're providing the function of informing the consumer as to the reasons why you would recommend an oil change outside of what their owner's manual says. And then you're documenting it on the document.
I would just follow up, Elisa, if this were to move forward and if it were adopted. I mean, those are big ifs from our standpoint. As I said at the outset, we're just kind of following through on the legislation that did not go forward to see if there was some interest in moving this forward. If that happened, a lot of our consumer complaint follow-up, it's a lot of mediation involved in that, a lot of education involved in that. I don't think, you know, there's not going to be this heavy-handed enforcement approach on something like this unless we see some, you know, down the road after implementing this, if, again, the big if it ever got adopted, there was an attempt by, or some pattern that we were showing to kind of abuse and bring customers in, but that would be based on a lot of consumer complaints coming in against a shop. Yeah, just like happens in other facets of automotive repair. Yeah, go ahead.
John Gallo, California Automotive Business Coalition. You know, last year when we were working with Senator Allen and the Bureau, and a lot of our members and Jack Maladano spent a lot of time really trying to work through the Senate bill that was being proposed last year. And what we finally did with our members was just say, you know what, the simplest thing to do on the oil change sticker is put today's date, the day's mileage, and let the consumer make the decision on when they bring it back for an oil change. That was one of the easiest things to try and resolve the issue last year as we were trying to look at this piece of legislation moving forward. But the real challenge that we had was trying to figure out, okay, that's the simplest part. But when it comes with vehicle lights coming on and mileage indicators, and to Jim Fogelquist's point, you know, you've got the customer that you have in your system, you have all the history of the vehicle and everything that's been done, that's an easy one to figure out. But the customer you've never seen before that comes into your business, has a need for a service, and now it's just, you know, you're taking a stab at whatever they're going to tell you, which isn't always necessarily the truth about how they drive the vehicle, where they use the vehicle, and so on and so forth. But I think the challenge that we have is we're trying to look at what would be a standard for mileage intervals, for service intervals. And if we go all the way back to what Senator Allen was really proposing in the bill last year, it had little to do with the maintenance of the vehicle. It had everything to do with environmental protection and trying to reduce the amount of waste oil that's being generated. And that's really what prompted a lot of the staff to do all the work that they did on this bill. But when they came out with the bill initially, I mean, it didn't make any sense to mandate that consumers couldn't get their oil changed except for every 10,000 miles, taking nothing else into consideration. Just, that wasn't going to work. But I think as we look at the draft and the work that the Bureau's done on this particular regulation, there's just so many unknown factors right now that, you know, I think we need to really take more time to look at it and figure out what's the real solution that's workable in the marketplace.
If I may follow
Yeah.
up, John.
Please do.
Yeah, Black again, Automotive Oil Change Association. One of the key things that was discussed during the legislative process as well, and unfortunately there really weren't responses, it kind of went past it, but it goes to your point. Ironically, they're saying one of the main thrusts for this gets to the environmental issues. Two things were asked, but weren't really responded. First was, what's the air quality impact when you extend out the line? And again, maybe it's slight, maybe it's a lot. We don't know. But the question is, we have to take a look at the environment and not just go one on the waste stream, but also take a look at the air. Secondly, on the waste stream, when we take a look, at least we know a lot of the folks in our association, probably a lot of everybody around the table, almost all, if not all of the oil is recycled. So the irony is when you put up a number that talks about this is what's going to happen for ARDs, we're now changing your practice because we want to reduce the amount of waste in the stream. If most, if not all of the oil is already recycled, you're having additional requirements without the benefit that you're looking for. So it'd be important before you go forward to tease out that difference on where's the oil stream coming from. Because if you put more requirements on an industry, likelihood you're going to have more financial and time restraints, so it makes it harder for the customer to get their oil changed, which then leads them back to their backyard. And that's probably where most, if not all of that oil is coming from, when people are doing it themselves. So as we're looking at it, it's something that we want to make sure there's a direct nexus before you move forward.
All right, excellent points. Thank you. Where are we in our open discussion? Here. Deviations?
Yeah, how often are deviations from manufacturer's intervals recommended?
Which deviation, because again, if they say, because the manufacturer's gonna come and say, it depends on the amount of wear, the tear, the temperature, was it cold, was it hot, was it traffic? So how far down the logic tree do we go to say, yes, it's a deviation?
Well, let's focus on like the number, like in the owner's manual, where it'll say 5,000 or 7,500 miles. And then not focus on the other side of the variable for heavy driving or unusual circumstances.
Then let's get on the same page, Brad. In order to be able to say, let's do that, what's the type of driving that manufacturer has for that recommendation? And then we can say, let's overlay that with California's average driving, and let's see where those two match or where they don't. And then you can start getting into a more discussion, because then you're going to know the overlay. That is, if they're recommending something and it's for Tucson or New York, but it doesn't match us, or it does match us directly, the answer is going to be easier to be able to provide. All the variables that everyone around here will have to now analyze and make sure is top of what the top recommendation is.
How many consumers, what would be the guesstimate of the actual percentage of consumers that follow recommendations, whether it's their owner's manual or the last shop they were at, service facility? What is the percentage? So I actually think that there are a lot of consumers that go beyond their change oil date or mileage. because they procrastinate. And it's a place they don't want to go, is to go get their car serviced. So I have a small business, but I believe there are a huge percentage of, the consumers in this state that go beyond when they should have already had it done. I'd like to know if there's any studies on that. And, we're talking about pollution and all of this. There's vehicles leaking oil on the ground. No oil registering on the vehicle when it shows up. We have brand new vehicles, not to pick on anybody, but Jeep Grand Cherokee 2015, I believe. Technical service bulletin of it uses oil. So how do you make a recommendation on that vehicle? Well, I don't know. It says it uses a bunch of oil, in between so many miles. Well, come in every day and let me check your oil.
Well, how do you do it now?
Well, I basically explain to my customer that here's the bulletin. Vehicle has an oil burning issue, and I would definitely, if I were you, I'd keep an eye on your oil level, because I don't even know how the vehicle's out that way. And I personally wouldn't want to rely on a light to come on to tell me it's time for an oil change if there's a bulletin saying that this engine burns oil. So that's exactly what I tell my customer. There's just a lot of different things, but I was just trying to address what you basically asked, and I would like to know what the percentage of consumers that are going beyond, because we're focusing like everybody's doing exactly what we say, don't we wish?
I'm Jack Moladonna. I want to be respectful of your talk about the elephant in the room, about background of the SB in January, but there's a lot of history and there are a lot of players in here. A lot of time on this issue, and it was tied to the bill. In fact, the veto message on 7th pathway of 8. That discussion. It's a bigger discussion, but I wanted to play out so some of the folks talking about the technical issues, because out of order here. But I'd like to have that discussion, because I think that's a.
Do you have much more that you want to cover before we get into that topic?
Well, yeah, maybe we can leave that to the end, because it probably will garner a lot of input.
But Brian, if I could real quick, Bud Rice again with Quality. You asked Tracy what does she do today, and then she ran down where she was trying to be informative to the customer. The reason why it's a little cool in here right now, aside from the air conditioning, is we're wondering how we're going to get yelled at in this thing. Somehow we're going to get yelled at. We're trying to figure out how to avoid that. And at the point where she's saying, well, I'm trying to inform my customer, well, she missed step 3. What's the recommended service interval at 7,500 miles? Well, she's talking to her customer about oil leaking, and maybe the guy's got a different problem. So we're trying to figure out. I mean, this is almost like a Saturday Night Live skit to some degree. When do I need an oil change? Well, because you need it. No, you don't. Yeah, I do. I'm not writing you up. Why not? I want to buy one. No, I'm not going to sell you one. I mean, so it's as bizarre as that sounds. We're trying to figure out what pathway can we walk to both make sure the customer's getting a good shake, and we're not going to get yelled at. That's why it's a little cool in here right now, because we're trying to figure that out.
I mean, at least the way I envision it is, and that's why I keep asking the question of what would you do, what would you recommend, is because that's what we want. That's the whole idea behind this, is to put that the idea, what you're recommending into the, to make a record of it onto the invoice.
John Gallo again. I wanted to follow up on Tracy's comment because I think she touched on a very important topic. And there's actually a published list of the vehicles that are known to have high oil consumption, even though they're brand new. There are several studies out right now, a list of manufacturers and makes and models that indicate that these are consuming more oil than the standard engine. And that's another variable that has to be considered, because the last thing you want a customer to do is end up with an oil out because they ran out of oil because, well, I don't have to have my oil changed till 10,000 miles. They never go check that. I mean, when do they actually open the hood and pull a dipstick? When the engine starts knocking, typically. But.
Well, and I think we want to recognize, we don't want to hinder your expertise as an ARD. Because all of these things, these variables that you talk about, I mean, I think they are valid points. But the focus that we have is we want to get away from the mindset that your oil has to be changed every 3,000 miles, and more towards an informed decision-making process, and taking what you would tell a customer who comes in, or you see, I mean, if they just come in and say, I want an oil change, then that's customer request. That's all you have to, you're covered on that one. But I mean, like you said, in situations where you may be performing other work or something where they didn't specifically come in for an oil change, but you do notice something, and and the manual says 7,000 miles, but you look at it and you go, this oil needs to be changed. And you go to them and you say, your oil should be changed. I know what the manual says this, but here's some of the factors that we saw that we would say you need an oil change. And just taking that oral statement and putting it, distilling it down into something that you would put onto the invoice. The overall thrust here is to get people, aware of the fact that, like I said, that the 3,000 mile standard it's not written in stone. I mean, and also to provide that latitude, and the expertise or the knowledge of an ARD who can look at a given situation and figure out the variables and say, you need an oil change, not every 10, or you should wait 10,000 miles. It needs to be done now, or it needed to be done 3,000 miles ago because of X, Y, and Z.
I had a comment that came in from David Kusa, ASCCA president, on the webcast. Educating the vehicle owner that their manufacturer may recommend a specific oil change interval is a good idea. I know of no manufacturer that still recommends a 3,000 mile interval. We should craft this regulation to educate the consumer and industry, but allow the trusted service provider to consult with the vehicle owner to determine the best change interval based on the vehicle usage.
And I think that's, when we've been discussing this and trying to write it, that's been the focus, is we don't want to just go lockstep with what the manual says. We want to be able to provide an informed consent. Because, like some of the comments, if you go 10,000 miles or the recommended service interval on something, and that may not be in the best interest of the consumer, and their vehicle, it may damage the vehicle, it may have a negative environmental impact for other reasons. But, that's the type, and that's the way I envision it is that's something that you would state to the customer when recommending the oil change to them, and we're just asking for the additional step that you would provide the reasoning in the invoice or an attached statement. And there's a myriad of ways that you would be able to do that. You may want to. There may be situations where it may be beneficial to go in and revise your POS system to do a drop down or things of that. But I always look at things. At least when I have to file these things with OAL, they want economic impact analyses of these things. So my focus on this is always what is the cost of minimum compliance on this? And I don't want to sound flippant, but the cost of minimum compliance on this is, I guess, is a pen that you would just write on, if you could write it in a legible manner on the invoice, or a piece of paper, and then you could write it longhand. You can do this a bunch of different ways. You could have where you could input it into an invoice, or type it out onto a piece of paper that would be printed out and attached, or just writing it on. we always look at, we're sensitive to costs of the industry. And like I said, I mean, I always look at what's the minimum cost of compliance on these things. And that, I mean, if I'm wrong, please tell me, but I mean, that's, I guess my takeaway is that would be the minimum cost.
So with regard to the cost, Jack Molodonov again, there is a required disclosure in the Allen bill. And I remember that discussion. That was one of the points that would be heartburn, especially some of the larger facilities. Changing their POS system is not as easy as, hitting the button. So closure part of that, there was some costs involved. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it wasn't just, putting it right. There are some costs involved because it is a mandate now.
Okay. I guess shifting the focus somewhat to alternatives. I mean, we're amenable to alternatives to what we have proposed now.
I kind of agree with what you're saying. And then, document, you're requiring additional documentation. Which sometimes is, but who judges this? Who's the judge? Where's the judge of the recommendation was right or the recommendation was wrong? Where does that get judged? And who is the judge of that?
Well, I mean, it would be, I guess it would fall under an enforcement action when in the standard procedures for enforcement. There's always, an arbiter ultimately of who's right and wrong. I mean, I can't, I mean, I'm not that person, so I can't say what is, I mean, I guess it would be a case-by-case basis. I mean, if you're using if you're creating, a subterfuge to change it, to perform an oil change, I would say, that a circumstance that's not accurate or true, that would be an issue that you're running the potential of violating, having a violation. But I mean, just making a recommendation based on what you see, and having someone down the line second guess that, I don't really anticipate that as being an issue, as long as you're making some sort of minimum attempt to report what you're observing, your variables that you're observing, and the basis of your decision.
The reason I bring this up is because I think it is important, and I think that everybody wonders what that is. And I, for instance, I don't work in service on vehicles myself. I just own a business. But, sometimes I have this debate with my very own technicians. And, they'll be saying something, and I'm thinking, saying, they're the ones working on the car. Why should I be questioning them, right? They're the pros. But, so it's just like any of us in this room. We could all receive the same vehicle in our shops, and maybe we'll have different recommendations depending on the person's experience or just their belief system on what is really happening with an oil change, and the vehicle and the year and miles and all of that sort of thing. So that's where I'm wondering, it's like, well, who's the judge of this? Because I can see everybody having different recommendations at different times.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be hard for the Bureau or anyone to be able to step into that that conversation and that documentation and say this wasn't what we would recommend, or whoever is looking at it. So it'd be an impossible task to do something like that. But you'd still have that documentation and that conversation with the consumer. And as Brian has said, I mean, if that's properly documented, I mean, what more can be done other than you've properly educated your customer, and they've made a decision based on your recommendation to have that oil change sooner than what the manufacturer is recommending.
don't quote me on the exact language, but, in regards to any potential violation or complaint, the basis is typically, my understanding is that was the work performed in a workmanlike manner according to accepted trade standards? And I guess that would be the benchmark here. I mean, if you're off in left field with your recommendations, then you're not meeting that basic, your trade standards. But it's like being a doctor. If you do all you can and your patient still dies, you're not going to go to jail because of that. We do recognize that there are variables, and a lot of this is judgment calls. But I mean, if you can make recommendations based on your knowledge and experience and put them down, and later on, if it is something, somebody files a complaint, and you go back and you look at what is the industry standard on this? Was this performed in according to accepted standards in a professional, workmanlike manner? And if yes, then that would be the end of the inquiry.
Brian, just a suggestion, Mark had just presented the stats on complaints in the last advisory meeting this morning. And looking at the report, you've got 440 complaints on oil changes. And maybe it would be a good idea to take a look at those 440 and see what really caused that complaint. It may give us a nexus or a basis on what are we really talking about. Are we talking about mileage intervals? Are we talking about the way the service was performed or how it was recommended? You may have some internal information based on those complaint stats that help lead you to figure out, okay, if we're going down this path thinking it's all based on mileage recommendations and yet your complaint data completely takes a quick left, all of a sudden it's okay, maybe we've got to relook at what we're really trying to create here.
I think that's an excellent point, and we definitely will seek to do that. So, if there's no other discussions on the potential alternatives, I think we could go to the additional issues, which we can now discuss the elephant in the room.
I'd like to just make one more comment. I was tickled to hear that we're going to do electronic authorization first, because the size of these invoices are getting huge, and I think the waste stream is paper, not oil. But this is just one man's opinion.
Yes. Yes.
Along those same lines, I think requirement where the because you don't want to be left off of one. I'm just bringing this up to your point. Also, I mean,
Yeah, just to be clear, I mean, there is no prohibition against putting that disclaimer on if you come in to get your tires rotated and you put it on there, that's not a problem.
I know it's not a problem. I just that's
Can I say one point? Aaron Lowe with the Auto Care Association. I mean, the fear that I would have with this rulemaking is that you sort of create a safe harbor with the OE recommendation that if you take that OE recommendation, then you don't have to worry about being questioned by bar. But as everybody said, there's a lot of cases where that's not really the best for the customer's car. And so you set that as the limit that because they don't want to fear getting hit with a vague because they put something on there that the inspector says, well, there's an issue or complaint. You could create a safe harbor here that everybody decides, well, we'll just go down that OE, whatever that number is. And that number doesn't reflect the real world reality of those vehicles. I mean, I think we're not sure where the problem is that would create this because we see oil changes moving wider and wider anyway. So I guess that would be my biggest fear with this rule.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Aaron.
I just, because the overriding issue, Jack Moldonoff again. So Senator Allen, last year, very contentious, worked with that being very contentious. Our industry got together on this. We originally had opposed the bill. And part of it was some of the technical aspects we just talked about. The other really important issue was that we thought that there wasn't a level playing field here. Now, under the existing law, minor repairs such as oil changes and tire repair and battery repairs are exempt from the BAR, from registration. And so we impressed upon Alan, and he agreed. He said, "You're right. We want to make sure that this law, that whatever consumer protections as you describe them, apply and across the board. There's a level playing field." For a better term, but the unregistered, unlicensed folks ended up coming in, and they essentially agreed that they could comply with this, but they wanted to be captured differently, a different category. And if I'm automotive maintenance providers, it would have been a different category. But the intent was to make sure they complied with this level playing field. And this bill was tied into AB 873. They were joined together. So as we were going through that process, I know that there was concerns from the, from BAR, how this separate category would be, how that would fall. Because my understanding was everyone wanted to be just an ARD, but the unlicensed folks, the unregistered folks, they felt their business model was different, so they needed a different category. Alan agreed to that. It was put in the bill. So the bill gets vetoed. Obviously, it's tied into 873. Now we're here today, and we're talking about some of the technical points, which all been good discussion. But what we're missing here is this doesn't capture the unregistered folks. So first of all, I don't think the intent here follows what Senator Allen had asked for, because he did commit to this. So number one. Number two, there's not a level playing field here for shops. It's not fair for the ARDs to have to comply with an additional regulatory burden, and then you have these unregistered folks that don't have to comply. So they don't have to comply. That's not fair. And frankly, it's not good for consumers. I mean, so consumers now, they go to one place, ARDs, and they get consumer protections, but if they go to another place for the same oil change, they don't get consumer protections. That's bad policy. I mean, in my opinion, this needs to be fixed. And I don't know that in terms of your regulatory authority and all that, but there needs to be a global solution to get this thing. Because just moving with one piece here, frankly, we're wasting time, doing it. I mean, because you have to put it together. And so it's my feeling. I've got serious concerns with this draft. We can work on the language and good comments, but if you don't capture the unregistered folks somehow, however that be, we can argue about that, but this doesn't make any sense in my opinion. That's what I wanted to lay out. And I know there's other folks here who participated last year and were very involved and spent a lot of time on that, but I wanted to at least lay that out for the record.
And Stan Van Vleck, Pat, and you and I actually had a brief conversation as we walked in saying we should probably talk. And so I apologize. I went by the notice and said we have 2 to 3, so I've got to be back at 3:30 for an important meeting. But with that said, Jack is relaying an important issue, and Mike and others dealt with it this last year. And again, on behalf of the Automotive Oil Change Association, we're in an interesting situation because you have in our organization, they are ARDs and what we call AMS, the people providing maintenance repairs, that stepped up last year and said, we want to, where it's appropriate, to be treated the same. That is, if we're not doing a repair, we want to be treated still under the auspices of our organization, but not held to the standards of those same things that you do for repair. But for those things for consumer protection, similarly what we're talking about here, we are willing to do that. Irony was, in a bill that actually at the end was not contentious, You had all stakeholders saying, yes, we're okay. You had what we understood as a bill that was going through that was favorable from the consumer standpoint, from the environmental standpoint, and from mostly the automotive industry standpoint. And then the governor took the action they did. Our understanding was it was from the agency level, not to point fingers, but trying to figure out, because if we have to solve it, we have to go back to wherever that problem was and open that up and figure out what we can do. We're looking at a situation where you could now have regulation of an area where you said you wanted to have regulation. Auspices, they'd be under control, but it would have to be for what they do, maintenance, not repairs. And so that's the way things were kind of left with the veto. And we're at a point of, our folks have said, and it candidly, there are a lot of folks who weren't excited about this in the industry because, again, they didn't think it was necessary. Folks who stepped up and said, we'll do it. There are discussions that should be had. We will partake in those discussions. So it would seem to be best for the same people you're saying we want to make sure that the oil changes and all those things are appropriate. If you want to have them protected the same way, sense. Not just on a disclosure that we're still not sure works, whether it does or not, but for the overall auspices of making sure that people who are in business can understand what the rules and regulations are so they can comply. The people around this room and the others, the vast, vast majority of them want to comply with the law. I know you folks want to help them to do that. And so if we can get people on a common ground in terms of understanding what the bright lines are, and if they're not bright, get them as clear as possible and help people. Not a very short window here to bring everybody together because you still have the momentum from last year. Our association, again, internally, folks were saying, why are we doing this? You don't need to. That yes, we do. Or that erodes too much to bring folks together and say, let's protect consumers on both sides. But let's also protect the businesses to give them guidance so they know how to do business. So if you're willing to do it, we can have the discussion more. I apologize, I can't partake in it more, but we are prepared to have that discussion.
Bud Rice with Quality Tune-Up, and if I understand the comments, you're really $200 away, right? I mean, a shop has to pay $200, get an ARD, and the services that they do, they'll be under the ARD umbrella. The services that they don't do, they don't have to worry about it anyway. You know, so,
But yeah, yes, you give $200, you have to sign up that says one's AMP, you have to do the things that AMPs do.
I have a question. Well, I guess we would file it under additional issues. You know, with all due respect to, the fairness issue that, we are regulating the ARDs or making the ARDs do this, but there's this whole other world of unregulated oil changes that don't have to comply with what we say. And honestly, that's true. And it's the operation of the Act. So the Act it exempts oil changes as minor services. We can't regulate the oil change per se, but and that's why I listed those two portions of the Act that we believe does give us the authority to perform this in terms of the invoicing requirement for all work, whether it's a minor service or not by ARDs, and then the other one about the potentially misleading advertising. I guess taking it one step more in terms of, in a fairness issue, do you perceive any type of benefit from these disclosure requirements where an ARD, who does disclose this type of stuff would have a competitive benefit over an unregulated one that does not? And I guess where I'm coming from on this is, when I have my car serviced, trust is a big issue with me. I will go somewhere, and if somebody is straightforward with me and honest, or at least I perceive them to be, I'll come back to that place. And if and if I perceive them as not being entirely honest or forthright, I won't go back there. And so do you perceive that, having to, if the public sees, well, look, I can go to an ARD and they're going to provide me with a written notice and they're going to provide me the written reasoning for oil change frequency as opposed to the unregulated one that doesn't. Do you perceive that the public may go to an ARD as opposed to an unregulated facility because of that?
Before you get some comment, Pat, you're stomping on somebody's glasses.
And I apologize, I do have to leave, and also I think just we need to be careful on a notice record that when you set a certain time to go beyond it, we just have to be careful and also beyond the scope of the substance. I think.
Said 3?
At 3.
Oh, it
It said on the notice it said 3.
3:30.
So we just have to be careful on that. But the good news is BAR has control over this issue. Because if BAR says yes, the governor's office says yes, and
Jack,
How
Well-
did that seat just happen to be open when we started this thing?
Just to kind of respond to your comment on that, you're going where you feel you can trust the facility you're taking your vehicle to. So all this other stuff isn't really mattering to you. You're going on trust.
Well, it's one focus. I mean, it's one aspect. And I guess when a consumer is going to go take their car to be serviced, I guess that, I would say, at least my personal experience, that is probably the overarching concern with me. Is that I'm going to go to somebody who's going to be honest with me, do the work that he says needs to be done. It actually needs to be done. And I'm not getting, they're not charging me for things that don't need to be done, or they're not performing the work.
And I think that's the majority of all consumers, exactly that. And kind of with that thought in mind, then none of this would matter. Or any of us. Okay? I just wanted to point that out. The other thing, I just kind of want to respond, and now I kind of feel bad he's not here, but back to that legislation, and it was, separating out like a maintenance provider license versus an ARD. And because we're not doing repairs, we're just doing maintenance and this and that. And I believe that we're all doing services pretty much, if your water pump is leaking, it has come to the end of its life, so we're servicing it. It's maintenance at that point. That went too long, okay? Same thing, TPMS light is on, and, come vehicles in there for an oil change. Is that a diagnostic? Is that a service? Is that a repair? Radiator hose is leaking. Are we taking it off and putting tape around it and putting it back on the vehicle? No, we're servicing it. It has failed. It has come to the end of life. So I just, no offense, I know a lot of time went into that legislation and that whole process. One of the things that wasn't brought up was that it made a whole nother licensing thing, which seems like a nightmare to me, but it also allowed them to still not give a written estimate and different things that we're responsible to do as ARDs. So Jack's right on point. We're all servicing vehicles. We all just need to fall under the same license, and if this is something that's to go through and go forward, it should apply to all of us equally. I'll try to stop now.
You have hit on an important point of the Automotive Repair Act, 9880.1 of the Business and Professions Code, specifically subdivision E. Repair of motor vehicles means all maintenance of and repairs to motor vehicles performed by an automotive repair dealer. And then it goes on from there and it lists the exempted services.
Just for the sake of clarity also, in terms of, leveling the playing field through legislative action, if the legislative will is there to do this, And even if we went forward with our regulations, then the statute would control ultimately, and our regulations would fall out, and the statute would control. So if there was a resurrection of 778, and it was passed and then signed by the governor, regardless of what we did in our regulatory actions, that would be supersede be primary.
Brian, John Gallo, California Automotive Business Coalition. I want to go back to your comment earlier about if one would give an unfair competitive advantage over the other. And if you really think about it in that perspective, if you have an ARD that's held to this new regulation, with mileage intervals being, in essence, prescribed based on the manufacturer, based on whatever guidelines that ultimately end up in the regulation. If you have that under the regulatory aspects of an ARD versus an unlicensed repair shop that's doing minor services that's not under an ARD, they're not held to that standard. So just by that mere fact, they have a completely competitive advantage over an ARD that's held to that standard, because they can make any mileage recommendations, they can make any service interval recommendations based on their professional experience, and they're not held to that regulation. And so in that, it gives them an unfair competitive advantage over an ARD that's held to that.
It also requires more documentation. So the regulated ARD is required, more time, their employees, this, that, documentation, and you have another business, not regulated, not required, take the extra time and document anything if they don't want to.
Bud Rice again, Quality Tune-Up. So if they're a business that's getting compensation in any form for any services that they're performing, they're an ARD, and they need to be an ARD. They need to pay the $200 and join the club. And then if they don't do these other services and these other repairs, don't worry about it. They're not going to get regulated by that stuff because they're not doing that stuff. But these things over here, then it's the exact same thing as the rest of us. That's how that should be played.
Well, if you have, I don't want to shut down discussion. If you have anything else at the time, please bring it forward. If you do think of anything else in the interim, you can forward it to my email. The other thing to keep in mind is if this does go forward, what we would do the next step after we got it approved by DCA and agencies, we would move on to, we would file what's called a notice filing with the Office of Administrative Law. It'll be published in the notice register, and then there would be a 45-day public comment period followed by a public hearing. So during that period, that would be the more formal time to voice opposition. That would be the opportunity to voice oppositions or to voice if there were alternatives or things of that nature, that would also be an opportunity to bring those up at that time also.
Voice support.
And support.
Oh, there's that.
I didn't hear any today.
I think just put the paragraph on your invoice and then be done with it. That's good, education.
Yes, Michael.
For what it's worth, I think Dan might be right. The email that went out said 2 to 3:30, but I was looking.
Yeah, I thought you.
Yeah, I think the actual notice says 2 to 3, but the actual email that everybody got said 2 to 3:30.
Oh.
Just FYI.
We can always go over.
I'm buying that to the extent it provides any value or something.
Okay, thank you. Wasn't aware. Okay, thank you. All right, this has been a very fruitful discussion. I appreciate all of the feedback on it. Again, it was to take what happened, was drafted in the legislation, and as you see, it was probably 99% of the same language that was in that bill as it relates to the oil change disclosures and intervals. sections of that bill 778. So we just took it as it was and put it in a regulatory format, but did not know all the issues we were going to hear today, but I think it's really helpful for us in making that next decision. Is this something we still need to go forward with? Is it something that probably needs to go back to the legislature to get some additional input on or direction for all of us? But we won't be able to make that decision just today. We'll kind of reconvene after we've ended here today back at BAR and with the department, and we'll keep you posted on developments. But I really, really appreciate all of the feedback on it. I don't know that we got this much during the legislative, how that process works. No one's sitting around a room like this to have a discussion. What? I didn't hear that.
Thank goodness.
No, yeah, and no, because some of the things get developed in a way that doesn't necessarily meet all of our expectations or interests, and so we don't really get to. You kind of hear about someone's concerns about or interests in pursuing something. You only get part of the story, and you don't get to give your feedback to that. So this was helpful. I really appreciate it, and you guys do a really good job, kind of steering us in the right path. So thank you very much for your participation. We'll look forward to seeing you in July at the next BAR Advisory Group meeting, and we'll hope to maybe have another regulation that can be workshopped. I don't know what else is out there that would be timely to discuss, but we'll give that some thought as we get closer to the July 20th meeting. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.